The attorney finished reading my stepfather's will. My brother stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He picked up the phone in front of me and said to our mother, "Come pick up your useless daughter. I don't want her anymore." Everyone in the room heard it. My mother's hands gripped the armrests. Nobody defended me. I looked at the empty chair where Graham should have been sitting and stayed quiet. I had no idea what he'd actually left me. But let me start from the beginning. This story weighs heavy, but I'm grateful you're here to share it with me. Before we begin, leave a quick comment. Are you listening while driving, cooking, working, or just taking a moment for yourself? Your voice matters here. A quick note. Some details have been fictionalized for storytelling, but the lesson at the heart of this story is what truly matters. The last of the mourners were leaving my stepfather's funeral when my half-brother decided to take control of everything. I stood by the tall windows of the Ashford Estate's main hall, watching November rain streak the glass while relatives in formal black clustered in small groups, their voices hushed but urgent. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies and roses, funeral flowers that filled every surface, their perfume cloying and inescapable. Graham Merritt, my stepfather, had passed 3 days earlier at 69, leaving behind an empire he'd spent 40 years building and a family he'd tried desperately to hold together. At 36, I had spent 5 years running the Ashford Charitable Foundation from a modest office tucked away on the 3rd floor of our family's headquarters, content to work without fanfare. I preferred it that way. But standing there in my black dress, watching the careful dance of inheritance speculation play out across the estate's Persian rugs, I felt the weight of unspoken questions pressing against my ribs. My half-brother Desmond, 39 and impeccably dressed as always, moved through the crowd with calculated charm. He touched shoulders, clasped hands, murmured condolences with just the right mixture of grief and gravitas. I watched him work the room like a politician on election night, and something cold settled in my stomach. Such a loss, I heard an elderly cousin say to Desmond, her voice trembling. Graham built everything from nothing. The family appreciates your support during this difficult transition. Desmond replied smoothly, his hand still on her elbow. Transition. I was already claiming ownership. I turned back to the window, but my reflection showed me what I didn't want to see. The resemblance to our mother in the set of my jaw. The wariness in my eyes that came from years of watching Desmond position himself for power. He thought he deserved by birthright alone. 3 days. That's all it took for grief to become a battlefield. The quiet click of expensive shoes on hardwood made me turn. Thornton Sinclair, 58, and carrying the weight of too many family secrets, stood beside the mahogany table near the fireplace. The sealed will rested beneath his hand like a loaded weapon. Immediate family only, please, he announced, his voice cutting through the murmured conversations. We have matters to discuss regarding the estate. The room shifted. Relatives began gathering their coats and handbags, exchanging meaningful glances that said everything about what they suspected was coming. Desmond straightened, smoothing his already perfect tie. Of course, he said. Time to address the family's future. As people filed toward the door, Thornton's eyes found mine across the room. The look lasted only seconds, but it was strange, almost apologetic, weighted with something I couldn't name. My pulse quickened. Why did the attorney look at me that way? The study felt smaller with just the 3 of us, dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the scent of old leather, and Graham's pipe tobacco still lingering despite his absence. I took a seat in one of the wingback chairs facing the massive desk, the same chair I'd sat in as a child when Graham helped me with homework. Desmond didn't sit. He moved directly to the chair at the head of the table, Graham's chair, and settled into it with the ease of someone who believed it already belonged to him. The gesture was so presumptuous, so calculated, that I had to look away. Graham would want the family legacy protected by someone who understands the business, Desmond said, his fingers steepled in front of him. Thornton set his briefcase on the desk with careful precision. "The will addresses all provisions, Mr. Ashford. I'm sure it does." Desmond's smile didn't reach his eyes. "But leadership requires more than documents." I said nothing. I had learned, over the years, that silence was often the strongest response to Desmond's performances. He wanted reaction, validation, conflict, anything to confirm his importance. When does a family gathering become a hostile takeover? The question whispered through my mind as I watched my brother lean back in our stepfather's chair, surveying the study as though cataloging what would soon be his. The rain picked up outside, drumming against the windows in steady rhythm. Thornton opened his briefcase, but before he could speak, Desmond held up one hand. "Before we begin," he said, his voice taking on a formal quality that set my teeth on edge, "I think we need to establish clarity about the family's direction moving forward." "The will," Thornton started, "will be honored, of course." Desmond's interruption was smooth as silk and twice as cutting. "But Graham's death leaves a vacuum. The company needs strong leadership. The family needs continuity." My hands tightened on the armrests of my chair. I could see where this was going, could feel the shape of it forming like a storm front moving in. "As the eldest son," Desmond continued, standing now, "I believe it's my responsibility to— What happened next would change everything." He rose from Graham's chair and turned to face us with the calm authority of someone who'd already made his decision. His hand moved to his pocket, withdrawing his phone with deliberate slowness. I knew without knowing that whatever came next would shatter the fragile peace we'd maintained since the funeral. He was about to make a call that would force everyone to choose sides. His thumb moved across the screen, and I heard the familiar sound of a number being dialed. He dialed our mother's number and pressed the speaker button so everyone in the room could hear what came next. The ringing filled the study, amplified and intimate all at once. Thornton's face went carefully blank. I felt my spine straighten against the wingback chair, some instinct telling me to brace for impact, even though I didn't yet know what form it would take. She picked up on the second ring. "Desmond." Her voice was calm, measured the voice I'd known my entire life. "Mother," he said, and there was something performative in his tone that made my stomach turn. "I need you to come to the estate. Now." "Come pick up your useless daughter," he interrupted, his words landing like slaps. "I don't want her anymore. She has no place in this family going forward." The silence that followed stretched impossibly long. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The words echoed in my skull. Useless daughter. Don't want her. No place, each one carefully chosen for maximum damage. He'd put it on speaker deliberately. I realized. This wasn't just cruelty. It was performance art, meant to establish dominance in front of witnesses. The line clicked dead before she could respond. Desmond lowered the phone with a satisfied smile, turning to survey the room as though he'd just delivered a particularly effective closing argument. His eyes found mine, and I saw the calculation there he wanted to see me break. Wanted proof of his power to wound. I gave him nothing. Years of board meetings and donor dinners had taught me how to keep my face neutral, when everything inside was screaming. "Family decisions require clarity," he said to the room at large. "I've just provided it." The room had gone silent except for the sound of my heart breaking. Thornton set his briefcase down with deliberate care, and I caught the muscle jumping in his jaw, the only sign of emotion on his carefully controlled face. The few relatives who'd stayed for the will discussion were studying the floor, the walls, anywhere but me. 60 seconds of silence. That's how long it took for him to destroy what remained of our family. I stood slowly, willing my legs to support me, preparing to walk out with whatever dignity I could salvage. But before I reached the door, a new sound cut through the awful quiet. Engines. Multiple engines. Desmond frowned, moving toward the tall windows that overlooked the circular drive. I followed his gaze and felt something shift in my chest. Not quite hope, not quite vindication, but something sharp and electric. 7 black SUVs rolled up the drive in perfect formation, their synchronized arrival suggesting planning and precision. They moved like a motorcade, like something official and unstoppable. "What is that?" someone whispered behind me. Desmond's triumphant expression flickered. She must have been nearby, but I knew better. I knew exactly who was in those vehicles and what it meant. The lead SUV stopped directly in front of the main entrance. The others fanned out in a semicircle, their positioning so precise it had to be rehearsed. Doors opened simultaneously, all 7 vehicles at once, and men in dark suits emerged. They weren't security in the rent-a-cop sense. They moved like professionals, like people who understood exactly how power worked and how to project it. And from the center vehicle stepped my mother, Celeste Ashford, 62 and still commanding every room she entered, stepped onto the cobblestones in a tailored black suit that probably cost more than most cars. Her silver hair was swept back in a perfect chignon. She didn't hurry. She didn't need to. The suited men flanked her, but she walked ahead, her stride unhurried and absolute. "I don't understand," Desmond said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "How did she?" I had no idea who was about to walk through that door. I heard the front entrance open. Footsteps in the hall, hers distinct and measured, the others following at a respectful distance. The study door swung open. She stood in the doorway, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Her eyes swept the space once, cataloging everything, before settling on me. "Sweetheart," she said, and her voice was gentle in a way that made my throat tight. Desmond stepped forward, his hands raised in what might have been supplication or defense. Mother, I was just..." She didn't look at him. Her attention remained fixed on me, and I saw something in her expression I hadn't expected to see. A fury so profound it had crystallized into something harder and colder than anger. "Mrs. Ashford," Thornton said quietly, and there was relief in his voice. One of the suited men moved to pull out a chair for her, but she shook her head. She crossed the room to where I stood and did something that shocked me more than Desmond's phone call. She pulled me into an embrace. I felt her hand on the back of my head, the familiar scent of her perfumed jasmine, and something darker, woodier. "Are you all right?" she murmured, low enough that only I could hear. I nodded against her shoulder, not trusting my voice. When she pulled back, her hands remained on my arms. She turned then, finally, to face Desmond. The throne he'd claimed was already occupied by someone who'd never needed to announce it. He stood frozen by its window. His earlier confidence evaporated. The relatives who'd witnessed his performance now saw something else entirely, A boy who'd played at power while the real thing walked through the door. My mother looked at her son with an expression I'd never seen her wear before. Profound disappointment wrapped in perfect composure. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Desmond," she said, "sit down." I sat. Immediately and without argument, sinking into the nearest chair like a marionette with cut strings. My mother turned from him then, dismissing his compliance as simply expected, and crossed the room to where I stood frozen by the window. She didn't hurry. She never hurried. But when she reached me, her hands cupped my face with a gentleness that made my chest ache. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" she asked, her voice low enough that only I could hear. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Her perfume smelled like home, like safety I'd forgotten existed. The jasmine and sandalwood mixture she'd worn for as long as I could remember wrapped around me like armor. "Mother, I can explain." Desmond started behind us. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge he'd spoken. Her attention remained fixed on me, her thumb brushing away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. The public nature of her protection was deliberate. She was undoing his humiliation with the same audience he'd used to inflict it. "You don't have to stay if you don't want to," she murmured. "Say the word and we'll leave." But I did want to stay. After years of watching Desmond position himself as the natural heir, watching him accumulate small victories and territorial claims, I wanted to see what happened when someone who actually understood power walked into the room. "I'm okay," I whispered. Her eyes searched mine for a long moment before she nodded, satisfied. Then, finally, she turned to face her son. The change in her expression was subtle but absolute. The warmth she'd shown me vanished, replaced by something colder and infinitely more controlled. Not rage would have been easier to witness. This was disappointment so profound it had weight. Real power doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, like gravity. "Mother," Desmond tried again, standing now, his hands spread in what might have been supplication. "I was simply establishing necessary boundaries for the family's future. With Graham gone, someone needs to—" "Desmond," one word, spoken quietly. "Stop." He stopped. His mouth was still open, another justification half formed on his lips, but no sound came out. She walked to the center of the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood with measured precision. The men who'd accompanied her remained in the hallway, their presence felt rather than seen, a reminder that she'd come prepared for whatever she might find. "I have heard enough for one afternoon," she said, her tone conversational, but carrying absolute finality. "Enough posturing, enough presumption, enough cruelty." The last word landed like a physical blow. Desmond flinched. "One of our cousins, Robert," I thought, though I couldn't tear my eyes away from my mother to confirm shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another cleared her throat, but no one spoke. No one would dare. Thornton stood by the mahogany table, the sealed will still resting beneath his hand. His expression had transformed from careful neutrality to something approaching relief, as though he'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it, and hoping for it in equal measure. My mother let the silence stretch. She had always understood that timing was everything, that the space between words could carry as much meaning as the words themselves. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer but no less commanding. "Please," she said, gesturing to the various chairs arranged around the study. "Everyone sit. There are some things that need to be said." It wasn't a request. People moved immediately, finding seats, arranging themselves as though this were a board meeting rather than a funeral reception, gone catastrophically wrong. I took my previous spot in the wingback chair. Desmond remained standing for a fraction too long before lowering himself back into his claimed seat at the head of the table, the position already looking less like a throne and more like a trap. When did silence become the most devastating response of all? My mother surveyed the room with the calm assessment of someone taking inventory. Her gaze touched each person, briefly cataloging, measuring, deciding. When she reached Desmond, she held his eyes just long enough for him to look away first. "My son called me here to discuss family matters," she said, her tone almost pleasant. "So let's discuss them." Thornton moved slightly, as though preparing to interject, but she raised one hand in a small gesture that froze him mid-motion. "Not yet, Thornton. There are things that should be addressed first." "Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, a note of something warning, concern in his voice, but she was already moving, crossing to Graham's chair, the one Desmond had claimed earlier, with such presumption. She settled into it with the ease of someone who'd sat there many times before, during countless family meetings and quiet conversations. Her posture was perfect, her expression serene. The contrast to Desmond's earlier performance was devastating. He'd taken the chair by force, by assumption of right. She simply belonged there. The room held its breath, waiting for whatever truth she'd come to tell. She folded her hands on the armrests, a gesture I recognized from childhood, the prelude to difficult conversations, to lessons that needed learning. When she spoke, her voice carried the measured calm of someone who'd prepared for this moment long before today. "Before Thornton reads Graham's will," she said, "I think it's time everyone understood exactly what Paloma has been doing for this family." Every head in the room turned toward me. I felt the weight of their attention, the sudden shift in focus. Desmond's expression flickered from confusion to something sharper, the first stirring of concern that maybe, just maybe, he'd miscalculated. My mother's eyes met mine across the room, and in them, I saw pride mixed with something fiercer, protection, vindication. "My daughter," she continued, her voice warming slightly, "has been running the Ashford Charitable Foundation for the past 5 years. Perhaps you'd all like to know what that actually means." What I'd been hiding for 5 years wasn't failure. It was success on a scale my brother had never imagined. My mother's voice carried the precise calm of someone reciting facts rather than making arguments. The Ashford Charitable Foundation was established 20 years ago with an initial endowment of $8 million. Under Paloma's direction for the past 5 years, it has grown to manage assets worth $35 million. The number landed in the silence like a stone dropping into still water. Desmond's head snapped toward me, his expression shifting from residual smugness to something closer to confusion. 35, but I thought you just worked in HR, processing paperwork. "She does both," my mother said, her tone suggesting his ignorance was answer enough. Quietly, without requiring recognition or announcement, I stayed silent in my wingback chair, watching the information reshape the room's understanding. Several relatives were nodding they'd known, had attended fundraising galas, or read annual reports Desmond had clearly never bothered to open. Robert, the cousin I'd noticed earlier, met my eyes with something approaching respect. "The foundation operates programs across 3 states," my mother continued. "Educational scholarships, housing initiatives, medical support for underserved communities." Paloma built partnerships with 17 nonprofit organizations and secured matching grants that doubled our impact. Thornton, still standing by the mahogany table, allowed himself the smallest smile. He'd watched me navigate budget meetings and grant proposals, had reviewed the quarterly reports I submitted without fanfare. He knew. Desmond's hands gripped the arms of his chair, Graham's chair, though it no longer seemed to belong to him. "I had no idea," he said, and for once his voice held no performance, just genuine bewilderment. "Because you never asked," my mother said simply. "You never even looked." 5 years of invisible work, revealed in 5 minutes of truth, but she wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly, her hands still folded on the armrests with that perfect composure I'd seen her deploy in 1,000 boardrooms. Last year alone, the foundation Paloma built served over 2,000 families, emergency housing for domestic violence survivors, scholarships for first-generation college students, a mobile health clinic that provides free care in rural communities Graham loved. Each item landed with the weight of documentation behind it. These weren't vague claims or motherly exaggeration. These were numbers she could prove, impact she could measure. She did this while also managing our corporate HR department, my mother added, maintaining both positions without complaint or request for additional staff. Last quarter, employee retention reached a 15-year high. I felt heat rising in my cheeks. Not embarrassment exactly, but the uncomfortable exposure of having work I'd deliberately kept private, suddenly displayed for examination. I'd chosen the third-floor office specifically because it was away from executive suites, away from attention. I'd filed reports that went to the board, but never sought credit beyond the necessary documentation. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" asked a voice from the side of the room. Margaret, Graham's sister, her tone genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "Because she didn't need to," my mother answered before I could. Real leadership doesn't require announcements. The contrast to Desmond's earlier performance hung unspoken but unmistakable. He'd proclaimed himself head of the family without evidence. I'd built an empire without proclamation. How many assumptions can collapse in a single conversation? Desmond's face had gone through several shades of emotion, disbelief, confusion, and now something that might have been the first stirring of shame. He looked at me as though seeing a stranger, someone who'd been standing in his peripheral vision for years, but never quite in focus. "I thought," he started, then stopped. What had he thought? That I was incompetent, unambitious, content to be decorative and dismissed? Maybe all of those things. Maybe none of them mattered now. Thornton cleared his throat, the sound carefully neutral but commanding attention nonetheless. "Mrs. Ashford, if I may, there is one matter we should address regarding the will." My mother's gaze shifted to him, something passing between them that I couldn't quite read, a question asked and answered in silence. "There is a special provision," Thornton continued, his words chosen with lawyerly precision, "that requires additional time before proper disclosure. Certain elements of Graham's estate planning involve complexities that shouldn't be rushed." I watched his hand rest on the leather portfolio that contained the sealed will. His fingers tapped once, twice a nervous gesture from a man who was rarely nervous. "What kind of provision?" Desmond asked, his voice lacking its earlier authority. "The kind that needs the right moment," my mother said, and her tone suggested the subject was closed. She stood with fluid grace, signaling the meeting's end. "Thornton will schedule the formal reading when all parties are prepared." Relatives began to rise, murmuring among themselves. I caught fragments of conversation surprise at the Foundation's scope, questions about Graham's mysterious provision, speculation about what came next. But that wasn't the only secret in that room. I was watching Thornton and my mother near the door when it happened. A glance between them, brief but weighted with meaning. His hand touched the portfolio again, and she gave the slightest nod acknowledgement of something shared, something deliberately withheld from me. The realization settled cold in my stomach. Whatever had just happened, my mother's dramatic arrival, the revelation of my foundation work, the public dismantling of Desmond's assumptions, all of it felt suddenly like staging. Not lies, but careful choreography building towards something I hadn't been told. "Sweetheart," my mother said, appearing beside me as the room emptied. "Walk me out?" I nodded, rising to follow her. But as we moved toward the door, I glanced back at Thornton one more time. I was watching me with that same apologetic expression from earlier, and I understood with perfect clarity. Whatever revelation had just shifted the family's perception of me was merely preparation. The real secret, whatever that special provision contained, was still waiting. 2 nights of questions without answers taught me that waiting for truth required more patience than I possessed. The Ashford Financial Group headquarters sat dark and quiet at midnight. Only security lighting casting long shadows through the glass-walled offices. I'd used my keycard to enter through the executive entrance, nodding to the night guard who knew better than to question my presence. If they won't tell me, I'll find it myself. My office on the 3rd floor felt different. At this hour, the familiar space transformed into something liminal and strange. I'd spent 2 days replaying that moment in the study, watching Thornton and my mother exchange their weighted glances, their silent agreement to keep me in the dark about whatever Graham's will contained, the special provision. As though I were a child who needed protection from complexity, I started with the filing cabinets against the far wall, pulling drawers that held archived foundation records going back a decade. Donor agreements, grant applications, partnership contracts, the paper trail of work my mother had revealed to devastating effect. But nothing here explained Thornton's careful words or that apologetic look he kept giving me. The company's historical files were stored digitally now, but the truly old records, the ones from Graham's early years building the business, those remained in physical form in the basement archives. 20 years of family history had to leave a trail somewhere. I took the stairs rather than the elevator, not wanting to announce my presence any more than necessary. The basement level smelled of concrete and old paper, the air noticeably cooler. Fluorescent lights flickered on with my movement, triggered by motion sensors that hadn't expected activity at this hour. What do you find when you stop asking permission to know your own family's truth? The records room stretched longer than I'd remembered. Rows of filing cabinets and banker's boxes organized by year and department. I started with 2004, the year my mother married Graham. The year our families merged in ways I'd thought I understood. Board meeting minutes from that period showed standard business discussions. Quarterly earnings, expansion plans, personnel decisions. Graham's handwriting appeared in margins occasionally, neat notations that revealed his methodical mind. But nothing suggested hidden arrangements or secret provisions. I moved deeper into the archives, pulling boxes marked with Graham's personal filing system, contracts, correspondence, legal documents reviewed and filed. My hands grew dusty from decades-old paper, my back aching from crouching between filing cabinets. Then, in a box dated October 2004, I found financial transfer records that made me pause. Regular quarterly disbursements to an account number I didn't recognize. Not large amounts by corporate standards. 50,000 here, 75,000 there, but consistent. Every 3 months for 20 years, like clockwork. These transfers, they've been happening for 20 years. I flipped through more pages, finding references in board notes to special arrangements per family agreement and confidential provisions as discussed. The language was deliberately vague, the kind of careful phrasing that said everything and nothing. Someone had ensured these records would remain obscure unless you knew exactly what to search for. Who hides something for 2 decades? Unless they were protecting someone. But who? My phone showed 1:47 a.m. I'd been searching for nearly 2 hours, and exhaustion was beginning to make the fluorescent lights blur. But I couldn't stop, not when I felt this close to understanding. The next box held correspondence between Graham and various financial institutions. Letters confirming account establishments, annual reviews, beneficiary designations that had been carefully redacted before filing. Someone, probably Graham himself, had gone through these documents with black marker, obscuring names while keeping just enough information for record-keeping purposes. Then I found it. A single page, Graham's handwriting across the top in blue ink. Meridian Trust Fund Annual Review Pending. Confidential per family agreement. The date, January 15th, 2005. 3 months after he married my mother. No dollar amounts. No beneficiary names. Just that notation, and one additional line. Trustee, Thornton Sinclair, Sinclair Law Offices. Meridian Trust Fund, Meridian. I read the words 3 times, as though repetition might reveal meaning that wasn't immediately apparent. This was what Thornton and my mother had been protecting, what that special provision referenced. A trust fund established 20 years ago, managed all this time by the family attorney, kept secret from both Desmond and me. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. 20 years ago, right after Mom married Graham. This is what they're hiding, but whose name is on it? I photographed the document with my phone. The camera flashed stark in the dim basement. Then I sat back against the filing cabinet, mind racing through implications I couldn't quite grasp. A trust fund created at the exact moment our families merged, managed by Thornton, kept confidential by family agreement for 2 decades. And now, with Graham's death, that agreement was apparently ending or changing. The special Thornton mentioned must be instructions about this trust, about what happened to it next. Some names change everything, even when you don't yet understand why. But who was the beneficiary? If it had been for me, surely my mother would have told me. If it had been for her, there'd be no reason for secrecy. Which left only one possibility that made sense. Desmond, a trust fund for my half-brother, established when his mother remarried, kept hidden from him for 20 years. But why? To protect assets from his biological father? To ensure he couldn't access funds until a certain age or condition? To shield money from his own potential recklessness? I looked at the photograph on my phone again. The words clear, despite the poor lighting. Meridian Trust. If I wanted answers about who this trust protected and why, there was only one person who might help me find them. Despite everything that had happened between us, I needed to talk to my brother. I asked him to meet me alone in conference room C. And surprisingly, he agreed, probably expecting me to apologize for existing. The room was small, windowless except for the glass wall facing the hallway that I'd deliberately covered with privacy blinds. Desmond arrived exactly on time, his suit immaculate despite the early hour, his expression guarded. Huss sat across from me without greeting, hands folded on the table in a posture that suggested boardroom negotiation rather than sibling conversation. I'd decided not to mention Meridian Trust, not yet. I needed to understand the man before the mystery. "Why do you actually want me gone?" I asked. Not the corporate answer, the real one. His jaw tightened. "This isn't personal. It's about what's best for the company. You called me useless in front of the entire family." That felt personal. A muscle jumped in his cheek. He looked away, studying the blank whiteboard. "You wouldn't understand. Try me. It's complicated." "Desmond." I leaned forward. "We've been siblings for 20 years. You don't call someone useless unless you're carrying something heavier than business strategy." He shifted in his chair, leather creaking. For a moment, I thought he might leave. But something pride, maybe, or the need to justify himself kept him seated. "You want honesty?" he said, voice edged. "Fine. You've had everything handed to you. The foundation, Graham's attention, mother's pride. You've never had to prove yourself, never had to work twice as hard just to be seen. When did we stop being siblings and become competitors for our own mother's approval? I've been running a foundation worth—" "That mother gave you!" He cut me off, volume rising. "Everything you have was given. You walked into this family and doors opened. No one questioned your worth. No one demanded you justify your existence." The bitterness was startling in its intensity. This wasn't professional rivalry. This was something older, nursed over years, until it had calcified into something toxic. "You think I haven't had to prove myself?" I asked quietly. "I think you've never understood what it's like to start from behind." He stood, pacing. "You were Graham's stepdaughter. I was the inconvenient reminder of mother's first marriage. You got welcomed. I got tolerated. That's not— You don't get to tell me what my experience was." His hand sliced through the air. "You weren't there for the whispers at family events, the questions about why I looked different from Graham, the constant reminders that I didn't quite belong. I stayed silent, watching decades of resentment pour out like water from a cracked dam." His face had flushed, carefully maintained composure disintegrating. "I worked for everything," he continued, voice shaking. "Every promotion, every acknowledgement, every scrap of respect. And you? You showed up and got handed a foundation. You barely mentioned it for 5 years, and suddenly, mother's revealing it like you built Rome while I was sleeping." "Because I did build it," I said. "Quietly, yes. But I built it. With mother's money. With Graham's name opening doors. With every advantage I never—" Then he said the thing he could never take back. "You've never had to wonder if you're the unwanted child from the first marriage." The words exploded out of him, raw and unguarded. Before he seemed to hear what he'd said, no one moved. No one spoke. His face changed instantly, color draining. His mouth worked soundlessly, trying to find words that could unsay what he'd just revealed. "Desmond," I said softly. "Forget I said that." He turned away, shoulders rigid. "This meeting is over," but I couldn't forget it. The words hung in the air, reshaping everything I'd thought I understood about my brother's cruelty. Not malice, fear, not ambition. Desperation to prove he deserved the space he occupied. "You're not unwanted," I said to his back. His laugh was hollow. You have no idea what you're talking about. Mother arrived at Graham's funeral with 7 SUVs. She embraced me first, yes, but she told you to sit down, and you did. Because you're her son, not her inconvenience. Stop! The word came out strangled. Decades of pain contained in one accidentally honest sentence. He stood at the small, high window that showed a slice of gray November sky. His reflection was visible in the dark glass, and I saw what I'd missed before. Not a man drunk on power, but a boy still trying to prove he belonged. Why didn't you ever talk to her? I asked. About feeling unwanted? Because I'm 39 years old, he said, voice raw. Because I'm VP of Operations. Because I can't be the one who needs reassurance. The silence stretched between us like a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. His reflection showed a man who'd just exposed the wound he'd spent 39 years protecting. And I suddenly understood with painful clarity that Meridian trust, whatever it was, might be connected to this exact fear. If Graham and my mother had created a trust for the unwanted child, if they'd hidden assets to protect him from his own insecurity, it would explain Thornton's apologetic looks. It would explain the 20 years of secrecy. It would explain everything. I stood alone in that empty hallway for 10 minutes after he left, watching 30 years of sibling conflict reorganize itself into something I finally understood. Desmond wasn't cruel. He was terrified. Every dismissive comment, every power play, every attempt to position himself above me, all of it stemmed from a child's fear that he didn't belong. The unwanted son from the first marriage. A wound so deep he'd spent nearly 4 decades building armor around it. The Meridian trust made sudden, painful sense. If Graham and my mother had created something 20 years ago, right when they married, right when our families merged, it could have been meant to prove to Desmond that he belonged. Financial security that said, you are wanted, you are provided for, you are ours. But why keep it secret? Why hide proof of belonging from the person who needed it most? I needed to know. Not to defend myself against his attacks. Not to win some family competition I'd never entered. To understand what our parents had been protecting all these years, and whether it could help heal what I'd seen broken in my brother's eyes. Understanding someone's pain doesn't erase your own, but it changes what you choose to do with it. I drove to Sinclair and Associates without calling ahead. The photographed document from the basement archives burning like evidence in my phone. Thornton's office occupied the 4th floor of a renovated brownstone in Back Bay. All dark wood paneling and leather-bound law volumes that spoke of old Boston money and older discretion. His assistant tried to delay me. Mr. Sinclair is preparing for a deposition. But I walked past her desk with the confidence of someone who'd spent 5 years managing board members twice my age. Thornton looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face, before professional composure reasserted itself. Ms. Ashford, I wasn't expecting. I found this in Graham's archived files. I held out my phone, the image clear despite the basement's dim lighting. Meridian Trust Fund, established January 2005. You're listed as trustee. He stood slowly, coming around the desk to look at the screen. His expression remained neutral, but something tightened around his eyes. Where did you find this? Company records room. It wasn't exactly hidden, just obscure. I pulled the phone back. What is it? Who does it benefit? And why has it been kept secret from me, and apparently from Desmond? Ms. Ashford, there are ethical boundaries regarding client confidentiality. Is this trust for Desmond? I interrupted. To address his fear about being wanted in this family? The question clearly caught him off guard. His mouth opened, closed. For a man whose career depended on controlling information, the silence that followed spoke volumes. Why does truth always hide behind the excuse of proper timing? I spoke with my brother this morning, I continued. He told me things I don't think he's ever told anyone. About feeling like the unwanted child from the first marriage. About spending 39 years trying to prove he deserved to exist in this family. Thornton returned to his desk chair heavily, as though his legs had stopped supporting him properly. Did he? So I'm asking you directly, as someone who's known this family for decades. Is Meridian Trust connected to that fear? Did Graham and my mother create it to protect him? You need to have this conversation with your mother. His voice was careful, measured. I will not breach her confidence. Even if that confidence is hurting the person it was meant to protect, even then. He met my eyes, and I saw genuine regret there. Especially then. There are reasons, Paloma. Good reasons that aren't mine to share. I leaned forward, palms flat on his desk. Your hands are shaking. He looked down at his trembling fingers, as though they belonged to someone else. With deliberate care, he folded them together, but the tremor didn't stop. Some secrets are too important to tell the wrong way, he said quietly. Please speak with Celeste. Let her explain what Graham intended. Let her tell you why certain provisions were made when they were made. When Graham died, you looked at me with this apologetic expression, like you knew something was coming that would hurt me. Was it this? Meridian Trust? He stood, moving to the file cabinet behind his desk. His hand shook as he turned the key in the lock, not opening it, but checking it was secure. The gesture was unconscious, protective, terrified. I've represented your family for 23 years, he said, his back still to me. I've kept confidences that would have prevented pain if disclosed earlier. I've watched people I care about suffer because timing wasn't right for truth. But I've never broken my word to a client, alive or dead. Fear doesn't live in words. It lives in the silence between them, and in hands that can't stay still. Please, he said, turning to face me finally. Talk to your mother, before the formal will reading, before this becomes public. Give her the chance to explain. I watched his hand rest on the locked cabinet, knuckles white with pressure. This wasn't about a modest fund or symbolic gesture. A veteran attorney who'd spent 40 years handling family fortunes didn't shake over minor provisions. Whatever Meridian Trust contained was significant enough to terrify him. This was something that could change everything for Desmond. For me. Maybe for our entire understanding of this family. But first, I needed to know if Desmond had been searching for the same answers. Thank you for your time, I said, and left before he could see that my own hands had started shaking too. The company audit logs told a story my brother had never intended anyone to read. I sat in my Cambridge townhouse that evening, laptop casting blue light across the darkened study, remotely accessing Ashford Financial Group's internal systems, with credentials that gave me visibility into digital footprints most employees never knew existed. If Desmond had been searching for answers about Meridian Trust, the system would remember, and it did. The first access attempt appeared in October, 6 months before Graham died. A search query in the archived files. Database, Meridian Trust beneficiary. No results. Followed 3 days later by Trust Fund Established, 2004-2005. Still nothing that wasn't locked behind Thornton's attorney-client privilege. I scrolled through months of search history, watching my brother's desperation unfold in database queries and file access timestamps. He'd tried everything, searching board minutes, financial transfer records, my mother's personal correspondence that had been digitized for record keeping. Each attempt more creative than the last, each one hitting the same walls I'd encountered. October. He started searching in October. Graham was still healthy then. This wasn't about the funeral. This was months in the making. My hands stilled on the keyboard as implications settled like ice in my chest. The power play in the study. The cruel phone call dismissing me as useless. The attempt to claim family leadership before the will was read. None of it had been grief-driven impulse. Desmond had been planning to take control long before there was anything to take. He'd been planning this before Graham was even sick. But why? If this was pure ambition, why the desperate search for Meridian trust? Why spend 6 months hunting a secret he couldn't name? I dug deeper into archived emails, searching for any correspondence containing Meridian. The system filtered through thousands of messages before returning a single result: an email from Desmond to himself, dated October 19th. The preview text made my breath catch. Need to understand what Meridian is before any will reading mom's been too careful with the name. I opened it fully. Just those 2 lines. No context. No follow-up. A note to himself. A reminder of a mission that had consumed him for half a year. Meridian. He knew the name. He's been searching too. But where had he heard it? Had someone mentioned it in passing? Had he overheard a conversation between our mother and Thornton? Or had he been searching financial records so thoroughly that he'd stumbled across the same obscure reference I'd found? 6 months of digging, and he still found nothing. What did Mom hide so well? We'd been looking for the same answer from opposite sides. Me driven by curiosity, and Thornton's fear. Him driven by... what? The same fear of being unwanted that he'd accidentally confessed this morning? A need to control whatever secret might define his place in this family? Which comes first, the fear of being unwanted, or the plan to control everything that might prove it true? My phone buzzed on the desk beside me. A calendar notification. Estate of Graham Merritt official will reading. Scheduled for 7 days from the funeral. November 18th, 10:00 a.m., Sinclair and Associates. 7 days. The deadline was no longer theoretical. I stared at the notification, then back at my laptop screen, showing Desmond's email to himself. We were racing toward the same truth, both terrified of what it might reveal, neither willing to simply ask the one person who could answer. My mother knew we were searching. She had to. And yet she remained silent, waiting for Thornton's formal reading, as though truth could only arrive on schedule, properly documented and witnessed. Another email notification appeared in my inbox. This one marked high priority. From Desmond's work account to Thornton, sent 40 minutes ago. Request private disclosure of relevant trust provisions prior to public reading family continuity concerns. So he was still pushing, still trying to control the narrative before revelation arrived. I thought about his confession this morning. The accidentally honest moment when he'd revealed the wound he'd spent 39 years protecting. Then I thought about these search queries, these calculated attempts to uncover secrets, months before they'd matter. Both things could be true. He could be genuinely wounded and genuinely calculating. Fear didn't make someone noble. It just made them desperate. My phone buzzed again, but this time with an incoming call. Desmond's name on the screen. I let it ring once, twice, considering. We hadn't spoken since the conference room confrontation this morning. What would he say now? Would he apologize for the unwanted child comment? Pretend it hadn't happened? Demand I stay out of family business he considered his domain? On the fourth ring, I answered. Desmond, Vivica thinks I should demand a private reading before next week. His voice was tight, controlled. No greeting, no acknowledgement of our earlier conversation. She says waiting gives them time to manipulate the narrative. Vivica Caldwell, 37 and expensively styled even in Desmond's private penthouse, had been dating my brother for 18 months, long enough to have opinions about family money that wasn't hers. I'd met her twice at company events, watched her catalog assets with the precision of an appraiser pricing inventory. Them, I repeated. You mean Mother and Thornton. I mean anyone with advanced knowledge of provisions that affect my position. Your position. The phrase settled between us, heavy with implication. Not the family's position. Yours. Silence stretched across the line. 7 days isn't much time, he said finally. And I heard something beneath the words, not quite plea, not quite threat. If there's something I should know before, I don't know anything you don't, I lied, thinking of the document in the basement, Thornton's shaking hands. We'll find out together, next week. I ended the call before he could respond. 7 days. 7 days to find truth before it arrived in a lawyer's conference room, whether we were ready or not. 7 days passed faster than I'd hoped and slower than I could bear. And now we sat in Thornton's formal conference room waiting for truth to arrive in legal language. The space felt deliberately designed to witness family drama, dark wood paneling that absorbed sound, a mahogany table long enough to seat 16, leather chairs that forced upright posture rather than comfort. Morning light filtered through frosted glass windows, rendering the November day outside into abstract shapes that couldn't distract from the sealed document centered before Thornton. Desmond sat across from me, his suit impeccable, his posture relaxed in a way that signaled confidence. Vivica stood just behind his chair, one hand resting on the leather back in a gesture of territorial support. My mother had arrived last, taking the seat at the head of the table with the same quiet authority she'd displayed at the funeral, her expression giving nothing away. Other relatives filled the remaining seats. Margaret, Robert, a few cousins. I saw only at weddings and funerals. Everyone dressed in appropriately somber business attire. Everyone waiting to learn how Graham had divided the estate they'd all been speculating about for a week. Thornton cleared his throat. Thank you all for assembling. We'll proceed with the formal reading of Graham Merritt's last will and testament. Desmond leaned slightly toward Vivica, his voice low but audible in the quiet room. This shouldn't take long. I thinks he's already won. How many families have gathered in rooms exactly like this, waiting for love to be reduced to dollar amounts and legal clauses? Thornton broke the seal on the main document, the crack of wax loud enough to make someone jump. He unfolded pages that looked freshly printed, despite being dated years earlier. Graham's signature, dark and decisive, at the bottom of each sheet. I, Graham Charles Merritt, being of sound mind and body. The familiar legal preamble rolled out in Thornton's measured voice. Preliminary clauses allocating personal effects to various family members. Graham's vintage car collection to Desmond, who'd spent weekends helping restore them. His library to me, thousands of books I'd browsed during Sunday dinners. The Cambridge property to my mother, which surprised no one. To my beloved wife Celeste, the Cambridge residence and all contents therein, in recognition of the home she built from the house I owned. My mother's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly on the armrest. Thornton continued through charitable bequests, substantial donations to medical research, educational foundations, arts organizations. Graham had quietly supported. Each provision was standard estate planning, the careful distribution of a life's accumulation. Company shares shall be divided equally between Paloma Ashford and Desmond Ashford, subject to board ratification and the provisions outlined in Section 7, equal shares. But that's not what this is really about. Desmond shifted forward slightly, frowning. He'd expected majority control, I realized. The assumption that being eldest and male would translate to greater inheritance. Equal division wasn't defeat, but it wasn't the victory he'd been anticipating. Thornton read through more clauses, trust fund continuations, tax implications, executor responsibilities. My attention drifted to my mother, whose gaze remained fixed on Thornton with an intensity that suggested she was counting down to something specific. Everything so far was prologue. 20 minutes into the reading, Thornton reached the final pages of the main document. He set them aside with careful precision, and I saw his hand move to something else. A separate envelope, sealed with red wax. Graham's handwriting visible across the front, even from where I sat. The room's energy shifted. Everyone felt it. The transition from routine legal proceeding to something weighted with consequence. There remains one final provision, Thornton said, his voice careful. Separately sealed per the deceased's specific instruction. He held the envelope between both hands, turning it so we could all see Graham's distinctive script, to be opened only in the presence of Celeste, Desmond, and Paloma. Desmond leaned forward, confidence flickering into something sharper. What kind of provision? But Thornton wasn't looking at my brother. His eyes sought my mother's, a question asked and held in the space between them, requesting permission, not merely informing her of procedure. The silence stretched. I watched Celeste's face, saw the moment of decision pass across features that had spent decades perfecting composure. This was her choice, I realized. Not Graham's written instructions alone. She controlled when this got disclosed. She gave a single decisive nod. "Please continue, Thornton," she said, her voice steady. Vivica's hand tightened on Desmond's chair back. I caught the movement in my peripheral vision, tension transmitted through white knuckles and expensive rings. Whatever came next would answer 20 years of questions, or create 20 more. Thornton's fingers found the edge of the wax seal. The envelope crackled as he worked it free, the sound amplified by the room's perfect acoustics. Everyone held their breath. I felt my pulse in my throat, steady and insistent. The seal broke. Thornton unfolded a single page, his eyes scanning the contents quickly before he prepared to read aloud. But before he could speak, Vivica moved. She stepped forward from her position behind Desmond's chair, her hand now on his shoulder in a grip that looked anything but casual. Her voice cut through the silence with practiced urgency. "Wait, Desmond, you should request a private family meeting before this provision is read publicly." Every head turned toward her. Thornton's hands stilled on the unfolded page. My mother's expression sharpened. Desmond looked up at his girlfriend with surprise that suggested this wasn't a planned intervention. "What?" he said. "You have the right to privacy regarding sensitive family matters," Vivica insisted, her voice louder now, more insistent. "Before any public disclosure, Ms. Caldwell," Thornton interrupted gently. "This is a closed proceeding. Only immediate family and named beneficiaries are present." Still, she didn't move her hand from Desmond's shoulder. "Some things should be discussed privately first," Right, Desmond? Before Thornton could extract the document from inside the envelope, Desmond stood abruptly and requested a 10-minute recess. The request landed in the room's charged silence like a stone breaking glass. Thornton's hands stilled on the unfolded paper. My mother's expression remained neutral, but something tightened around her eyes. "I need a moment," Desmond said, his voice less commanding than uncertain. "Just 10 minutes." Thornton looked to my mother, who gave the slightest nod. "Of course," he said carefully. "We'll reconvene shortly." The conference room emptied quickly, relatives filing into the hallway with murmured speculation about what the sealed provision might contain. Vivica moved like she'd been waiting for this opportunity, her hand immediately finding Desmond's elbow and steering him toward the far end of the hall, where tall windows overlooked the street below. I deliberately positioned myself by the water cooler midway down the corridor, pulling out my phone and pretending to check messages while keeping them in my peripheral vision. The hallway's acoustics were better than Vivica probably realized, designed for discreet conversations, but not immune to careful listening. "You can't let them ambush you with whatever's in that envelope," Vivica said, her voice low but carrying. "Demand private negotiation before any public reading." Desmond's shoulders were tight, his posture defensive in a way I recognized from our conference room confrontation. "I don't know if that's appropriate. Our financial future depends on you acting decisively right now." She stepped closer, her hand moving from his elbow to his arm in a grip that looked anything but casual. "This is your inheritance, your right, our financial future. Not his, ours." Desperation makes people careless about who's listening. I filled a paper cup at the water cooler, taking my time, watching them through the distorted reflection in the stainless steel dispenser. Vivica's expensive suit, her perfectly styled hair, her practiced gestures of supportive concern, all of it suddenly looked like costume rather than character. "What if this provision changes everything?" Desmond asked, and there was genuine fear in his voice, not the calculating ambition from the funeral. "Fear. Exactly why you need to control how it's revealed," Vivica insisted. "On your terms, not theirs. You've worked too hard to let them dictate the narrative now." He'd worked. But she kept saying "our" and "we" and "us" when talking about money that wasn't hers and might never be. I caught fragments of her next words. Something about securing your position and can't trust what they've been hiding. Each phrase carefully calibrated to feed his fear, to weaponize his insecurity about being the unwanted child into action that served her interests. "You deserve to know what's yours before anyone else judges how you respond," she said. "Demand to see that provision privately, with your attorney present. Not in front of all these people who've never believed in you anyway." That last part was pure manipulation, painting the assembled family as adversaries when most of them barely knew enough to care about detailed provisions. But she was good. She'd identified Desmond's wound and was pressing directly on it with surgical precision. She wasn't his partner. She was a parasite wearing expensive perfume. Desmond's hand moved to his face, rubbing at his temple in a gesture I remembered from childhood stress, uncertainty, the physical manifestation of internal conflict. When he'd confessed his fear of being unwanted, I'd seen a glimpse of vulnerability beneath the arrogance. Now Vivica was exploiting that exact vulnerability for financial gain. He started, then stopped. "What if the provision is something that proves I was right to worry? That I never really belonged?" The question was so raw, so honestly frightened, that I really belonged? The question was so raw, so honestly frightened, that I felt my protective instincts surge, despite everything he'd done. This was my brother, wounded, manipulated, afraid of truth that might confirm his worst fears about himself. And Vivica was using that fear like a crowbar, prying open his defenses to insert her own agenda. "Then you'll know," she said, her voice softening into false sympathy. "And you can decide how to handle it without an audience, without judgment. Just us, making the right choices for our future together. Our future." She'd said it 3 times now. The claim wasn't subtle. She was tied to his inheritance in her mind, planning a life funded by money he hadn't received and might not receive, depending on what that envelope contained. Desmond's shoulders sagged slightly, resistance crumbling under sustained pressure. "You're right. I should request a private disclosure first." "Exactly." Vivica's smile was visible even in profile. "When we go back in, just tell Thornton you want to review the provision with your own legal counsel before any family discussion. It's completely reasonable. Again, how many bad decisions are made because we trust the wrong voice at the crucial moment?" Thornton appeared at the conference room doorway, clearing his throat gently. "If everyone's ready, we should reconvene." Relatives began filing back in, their conversations dying as they settled into leather chairs. Vivica kept her hand on Desmond's arm as they walked toward the entrance, her posture triumphant in a way she probably thought was subtle. Desmond caught my eye across the hallway as people filtered past us. His expression held something I couldn't quite read, part apology, part defiance, part desperate plea for understanding I wasn't sure I could give. Vivica's fingers tightened possessively on his sleeve, a claim of ownership made visible through touch. I knew what he was about to do. Knew Vivica had convinced him to demand postponement, to assert control over disclosure that was never his to control. And I had to decide in the next 30 seconds whether to intervene or let him make a mistake that might cost us both the truth we'd been searching for. The decision was made for me when my mother spoke first. My brother stood before anyone else had fully settled back into their chairs, his decision written plainly across his face. "Thornton," Desmond said, his voice carrying the formal tone he used in boardrooms when trying to project authority he didn't quite possess. "I believe it would be appropriate to pause the reading here for private family discussion." The conference room went still. Relatives who'd been rustling papers or adjusting chairs froze mid-motion. Vivica remained standing behind Desmond's chair, her expression carefully neutral, in a way that suggested coaching and collaboration. "Some matters are too sensitive for public disclosure without proper preparation," Desmond continued. "I'm requesting we reconvene in a few days, after immediate family has had opportunity to review this provision privately with appropriate legal counsel." Vivica's coaching was obvious in every word he chose. The careful phrasing, the appeal to propriety, the suggestion of delayed gratification, wrapped in concern for family dignity. It was well-rehearsed manipulation, dressed as reasonable request. Thornton's hand stilled on the envelope. He looked not to Desmond, but to my mother. Desmond noticed. "Mother, surely you agree that such personal family matters deserve discretion." "No, Desmond." Her voice cut through his argument like a blade through silk. "The truth has been delayed too long already." The words landed with absolute finality. Desmond's mouth opened, then closed. Vivica's carefully neutral expression flickered into something harder. "Mother, if you would just consider." "I have considered." My mother's tone remained calm, but her gaze held steel. "For 20 years, I have considered." Every angle, every consequence, every possible way to protect both of my children while being fair to both of my children. She turned to Thornton. Please continue. Some silences are louder than any argument. Desmond sank back into his chair. The fight draining from his posture like air from a punctured tire. He looked diminished somehow. His expensive suit and cultivated authority suddenly hollow. Vivica's hand landed on his shoulder in what might have been comfort, or might have been frustrated possession, I couldn't tell which. And maybe neither could he. Across the table, Robert shifted in his seat. Margaret folded her hands with the satisfied expression of someone watching family drama unfold at safe distance. The atmosphere had shifted from uncomfortable anticipation to something more complicated. A collective recognition that whatever came next was inevitable, had perhaps always been inevitable. Thornton cleared his throat, returning his attention to the envelope that had caused all this disruption. His fingers extracted several pages with careful precision, Graham's distinctive handwriting visible on the first sheet. My eyes caught the words even from across the table. Meridian Trust Fund. There it was. The name I'd searched for in basement archives and company databases. The secret Desmond had been hunting for 6 months. The provision that had made Thornton's hands shake with the weight of 20 years' silence. Before I read the provision itself, my mother said quietly, addressing the room but looking at neither Desmond nor me, I want you all to understand something. Every head turned toward her. How do you fight someone who's already made peace with what comes next? What you're about to hear has been kept confidential to protect someone I love, she continued. Not from greed, not from punishment, but because sometimes the kindest thing you can do is shield people from their own pain until they're strong enough to bear the truth beneath it. Desmond's jaw tightened. I saw him processing her words, trying to determine whether they constituted praise or indictment. Graham and I made this decision together, my mother said. Not lightly, not quickly, but together. And with more love than you might understand, until you hear the whole truth. She nodded to Thornton. He smoothed the pages flat on the table before him, and I watched Desmond's hands grip his chair arms with white-knuckled intensity. My mother's face remained serene, but I caught the slight tremor in her clasped hands. She'd been protecting this secret for 2 decades, and in the next 60 seconds, it would belong to everyone in this room. The final provision reads as follows. Thornton began, his voice steady despite the tension crackling through the air. Regarding the Meridian Trust Fund, established January 15th, 2005, in the amount of $15 million, managed under separate agreement by Thornton Sinclair of Sinclair and Associates, $15 million. In 2005. 20 years ago, which meant it had grown significantly since then. Desmond leaned forward, every muscle tense. Vivica's hand tightened on his shoulder. I held my breath. The moment before truth is revealed feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. This trust was established. Thornton continued reading. In the name of Desmond Charles Ashford, my stepson, whom I love as my own son, despite knowing he has sometimes questioned whether he truly belongs in this family we built together. The words hung in the air like smoke. Desmond's face had gone pale. Not angry pale. Not shocked pale. Something deeper. More fundamental. The color draining as the foundation of his assumptions cracked beneath him. The current value of the Meridian Trust, Thornton read, as of my death, is approximately $28 million. These funds are held solely in Desmond's name, to be released to him upon my death or his 40th birthday. whichever comes first. The trust exists because I wanted my son, and he has always been my son, to know he was loved and provided for, even if he spent years believing he was merely tolerated. $28 million in Desmond's name for 20 years. While he searched for proof he belonged, the proof had been waiting in an envelope he'd never known existed. Vivica's face had transformed from frustration to something approaching horror as she calculated what she'd just tried to delay. Millions she hadn't known about, secured in Desmond's name alone, completely separate from any negotiable family assets she might have influenced him to fight over. The silence that followed. Thornton's words felt like the moment after lightning, before thunder arrives. Desmond sat frozen, his face drained of color. Not the pale of anger, not shock. The pale of one whose entire reality had just been dismantled. $28 million. In his name. For 20 years, while he'd been searching company files for proof of conspiracy, the proof of his belonging had been growing quietly in an account he'd never known existed. Thornton continued reading. The trust was structured to provide financial security without the burden of public knowledge, allowing Desmond to build his career on his own merits. Release conditions. Upon Graham Merritt's death, or Desmond's 40th birthday, whichever occurs first. Desmond would turn 40 in 4 months. The money would have been his either way. Annual statements were filed but never disclosed to the beneficiary per explicit instruction. Thornton read. This was not withholding, this was protection. Protection. The word landed like an accusation against every assumption Desmond had made. 28 million reasons to reconsider everything. I watched my brother's hands grip the table edge, knuckles white. The teacup someone had poured sat forgotten, steam rising in lazy spirals. Across the table, Vivica had gone very quiet. Her face shifted through confusion, calculation, and now something approaching horror, as she understood what she'd tried to manipulate him into delaying. Millions she hadn't known about. Wealth that was his alone. Thornton set down the pages. That concludes the specific provisions of the Meridian Trust Fund. Wait. Desmond's voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. How long have you known? I was looking at our mother. Celeste met his gaze steadily, though I caught the tremor in her hands. Since the beginning. Since Graham and I created the trust 3 months after we married. 20 years. Desmond's voice cracked. You've known for 20 years that I thought, that I believed. He couldn't finish. We all knew what he'd believed. The unwanted child from the first marriage. I have always known you felt that way, my mother said quietly. Your biological father left when you were 3. You barely remembered him, but you remembered not having one. Then Graham came into our lives, and I saw you wonder if there was room for you in it. Desmond's jaw tightened. I wanted you to be secure, my mother continued. Not just financially. I wanted you to know, truly know that you belonged, that you were loved not out of obligation, but out of choice. Then why hide it? The question burst from Desmond. Why not just tell me? Because you would have seen it as pity. Her voice held absolute certainty. You would have interpreted it as proof that I thought you needed special treatment. You would have believed the money was apology for your existence, rather than celebration of it. The accuracy hung in the air. Undeniable. We all knew she was right. Desmond knew she was right. Before I tell you what she said next, are you still with me? Comment A if you think Desmond will accept this explanation, Or B, if you think he'll reject it. And add one reason why, in 10 words or less. Quick note: the next part includes some fictionalized details to convey the emotional impact and the lesson behind it. Sometimes the thing you fear most is the opposite of truth. $28 million, my mother said. Each word weighted. In your name alone, managed secretly, growing quietly, waiting for you. You were never overlooked, Desmond. You were protected from your own fear of not belonging. Desmond's hand moved toward the teacup, fingers trembling. The cup wobbled, tipped, fell. Dark liquid spread across the mahogany table, soaking into legal documents. I didn't notice. He was staring at our mother with an expression I'd never seen. Devastation and relief and shame all tangled into something that looked like grief for wasted time. Everything he'd built his identity on was a foundation of sand. I called you, he whispered. At the funeral. I told you to pick up your useless daughter. I was going to. I know, my mother said simply. I thought Paloma had everything. I thought you'd given her the foundation and given me nothing. I thought. His voice broke completely. Vivica stood abruptly, her chair scraping. Every head turned. This is, she started, then stopped. Her face had gone carefully blank, recalculating. I think Desmond and I should discuss this privately before. No. My brother's voice, though shaking, held finality. Vivica, please leave. Her mouth opened in shock. Desmond, we need to talk about how this affects our what? He looked at her fully for the first time. Our financial future? Our plans? She flushed. I heard you, he said quietly. In the hallway, telling me to demand private disclosure before any public reading. Talking about our financial future and securing my position. You didn't know about the trust. You were positioning to control whatever inheritance I might fight for. Vivica's carefully maintained composure cracked. That's not. Please leave, Desmond repeated. Now. She stood frozen for 3 long seconds, then grabbed her designer handbag and walked out, her heels clicking against hard wood until the conference room door closed with final precision. The silence she left behind felt cleaner somehow. Desmond turned back to our mother, his face wet with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. I wasted so much time being angry about things that weren't real. You were protecting yourself, my mother said gently, from a wound that felt very real to you, but it wasn't. The wound wasn't real. You always. His voice caught. You always loved me. Always, she confirmed. My brother sat absolutely motionless except for the tears, his overturned teacup spreading dark stain across documents that had just dismantled 39 years of assumptions. The conference room held its breath for perhaps 10 seconds after Vivica's departure, before my brother's grief transformed into something harder. This is theater. Desmond's voice, raw, desperate, shattered the moment. His fist slammed the table, making the overturned teacup jump. You orchestrated this. Some kind of sick performance to humiliate me in front of everyone. I watched him stand abruptly, his chair scraping against hardwood, and recognized the defense mechanism for what it was. Denial arriving late, after acceptance had proven too painful to sustain. Desmond, my mother said quietly. No. He pointed at me, then at Thornton. You wrote this. You fabricated documents to make me look like. To make me believe I was. He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't name what he'd been made to believe about himself. Thornton's expression remained professionally neutral, but his hand moved to the locked portfolio case beside his chair. "Mr. Ashford, I understand this is difficult to process." "Difficult?" Desmond's laugh was ugly. "You've been lying to me for 20 years. All of you. Pretending concern while hiding." He stopped, ran his hand through his hair with shaking fingers. "I don't believe it. I don't believe any of this." The fluorescent light overhead flickered once, twice, casting unstable shadows across the conference table. Marcus, my cousin, shifted in his seat at the far end of the table. "Desmond, maybe you should..." "Should what? Accept that my entire life has been someone's elaborate joke?" Desmond turned his fury on the assembled relatives. "You all knew, didn't you? Sitting here watching me make a fool of myself while you knew the whole time that..." "We didn't know," Margaret said firmly. "None of us knew until today." Desmond's gaze swung back to our mother. "Then you're the only liar here. You let me believe for 39 years. You let me believe I was loved." My mother finished quietly. "I let you believe you were loved, which you are, which you have always been." The silence that followed felt like broken glass. Thornton opened his portfolio case with deliberate precision, extracting a stack of documents thick enough to make Desmond's denial visible crack. The Meridian Trust was established January 15th, 2005. I have 20 years of quarterly statements. I began sliding pages across the polished mahogany, each one landing with whisper-quiet finality. Dates, dollar amounts, growth percentages, management fees. The steady accumulation of evidence spread like proof across the table. Desmond stared at the papers as though they were written in a language he couldn't read. "Initial deposit, $15 million, Thornton read from the first statement. "Depositor, Celeste Ashford. Beneficiary, Desmond Charles Ashford. Trustee, Thornton Sinclair, Sinclair and Associates." He slid another page. "Second quarter, 2005. Value, $15.2 million. Another. Fourth quarter, 2005. Value, $15.8 million. The pages kept coming. A steady rhythm of documented proof. Each statement bore the official seal of the bank, the signature of the trust manager, the quarterly progression of wealth, growing quietly in Desmond's name, while he'd spent those same years convinced he was overlooked. 2010, Thornton continued. Value, $19 million. 2016, $23 million. 2020, $26 million. A car horn blasted from the street below, sudden and jarring in the tense quiet. Desmond's hands trembled as he finally reached out to touch the first statement. His finger traced the date January 15th, 2005, like he was trying to determine if the ink was real. This was... His voice came out broken. "This was 3 months after you married Graham." "Yes," my mother confirmed. "Before I met Vivica." His hands moved to the next statement. "Before I made VP. Before." He looked up, devastation replacing denial. "Before everything. You knew. Before I even knew who I'd become, you knew I would..." His voice broke completely. The documents made soft shushing sounds as they slid across mahogany, truth spreading inexorably across polished wood. "I thought you saw me as a mistake," Desmond whispered, staring at 20 years of quarterly statements. "I thought the trust, if I'd known about it, I thought it would be proof that you pitied me. That you thought I needed special help because I wasn't..." "Wasn't what?" My mother asked gently. "Wasn't yours. Wasn't Graham's. Wasn't anyone's except the unwanted reminder of your first marriage." The words hung in the air, decades of fear finally spoken aloud. "You were always mine," my mother said, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. "Every moment of every day for 39 years, you were mine." The trust wasn't pity, Desmond. It was protection from your own conviction that you didn't deserve to be protected. Desmond's hands moved through the statements, touching each one like he was trying to absorb truth through his fingertips. 2005, 2008, 2012, 2018, 2024. His entire adult life, documented in quarterly intervals of steady growth. Thornton reached for another envelope, this one sealed with red wax. The old-fashioned formality of it caught everyone's attention. Letters weren't sealed with wax anymore, unless they carried weight beyond their words. "There's more," Thornton said quietly. "Your mother left instructions about why. An explanation she wrote knowing you'd need to understand not just what she did, but why she chose to do it this way." Desmond stared at the sealed envelope, his face a map of conflicting emotions. She knew, before Vivica, before the company, before everything. She knew I would. His voice caught. "She knew I'd spend my whole life believing I didn't belong. She knew you felt that way," I said softly, speaking for the first time since the denial began. "And she loved you anyway, maybe because of it." Thornton requested a brief recess after showing Desmond the sealed letter, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd reached his professional limit for emotional intensity. He caught my eye across the table and tilted his head toward the door, a silent request for private conversation. His office felt different from the conference room, smaller and more personal. The leather chair he offered me felt too soft after the conference room's hard edges. But I couldn't relax, not with the lawyer's hands trembling as he poured water. He didn't drink. "I need to tell you something," he said, settling into his desk chair with the weight of confession about the trust, about your mother's decision to keep it secret. I waited, watching condensation form on the untouched water glass between us. I begged her to tell him. The words came out rough. Every year for 20 years, I said transparency was kindness, that Desmond deserved to know he was provided for, that keeping it secret was cruel. But she refused, I said quietly. She said he'd see it as proof she thought him defective. Thornton's voice cracked, that the money would feel like apology for his existence rather than celebration of it. She said Desmond would interpret protection as pity, and pity would destroy what little self-worth he'd managed to build. I thought of my brother's face in the conference room, the way he'd called it theater and orchestrated humiliation before the evidence had forced him to accept truth. My mother had known him better than I'd realized. I witnessed her anguish over this choice for 2 decades, Thornton continued. Watched her see his resentment, his assumption that he was overlooked, and remain silent because she believed. He stopped, cleared his throat. Because she believed revealing the truth would do more harm than good. She chose his dignity over his forgiveness, I said softly. Thornton's water glass sat untouched, condensation pooling beneath it like the tears he wouldn't shed. I thought she was wrong, he admitted. I thought honesty was always better than secrecy. But watching him today, seeing how he tried to deny it, even when confronted with documentary evidence, he shook his head. She understood something I didn't. That some truths people have to be ready to receive, or they'll reject them entirely. He stood abruptly and moved to the wall safe, hidden behind a framed law degree. The dial spun left, right, left again with practiced precision. When the safe door swung open, he reached past folders and legal documents to retrieve a single envelope. Graham's handwriting marked the front. "For when the time is right." "Your stepfather gave this to me 3 years ago," Thornton said, returning to his desk. "Weeks before he died, he said I'd know when to open it." My pulse quickened. "What is it?" Graham understood Desmond in ways Celeste couldn't. Thornton opened the envelope carefully, extracting a USB drive and a handwritten note. He said some wounds need a father's voice, not a mother's. I took the note he offered. Graham's distinctive handwriting, steady and deliberate, it didn't look like a dying man's script. "Thornton," I read aloud. "When Desmond learns about the Meridian Trust, he'll hear it as his mother's judgment. He needs to hear from me that the wound he's carried isn't about being unwanted. It's about being too young to understand that stepfathers choose their sons. Show him this when he's ready. Give him permission to be angry about time wasted, and then give him the way forward." Graham, my throat tightened. He knew about the trust, the resentment, all of it. "Graham saw what your mother saw," Thornton confirmed. But he had something Celeste didn't, the perspective of someone who'd chosen to be Desmond's father, rather than being obligated to it by blood. I inserted the USB drive into his computer, double-clicking the single video file. Graham appeared on screen in his study, the familiar room where he'd spent countless evenings reading while I'd done homework at his desk. "Desmond," Graham's recorded voice said, steady and warm despite knowing these words would be heard after his death. "If you're watching this, it means the truth came out the hard way. Let me tell you what I saw when I married your mother." I watched 30 seconds before asking Thornton to pause. Graham spoke directly to camera, his tone gentle but unflinching, addressing what he called the invisible weight of being the first son. He named the wound without flinching from it, validated the pain without excusing the behavior it had produced. "He's giving Desmond permission to be angry," I said, "and a way out. That's what Graham intended." Thornton ejected the drive, holding the small device between us like it contained something both precious and dangerous. "The question is, do we show him now? While Vivica's mask is still off and he's already vulnerable." I thought about strategic compassion, about whether truth was kindest when delivered in moments of maximum pain or maximum receptivity, about whether my brother raw from revelation, stripped of his girlfriend and his justifications, could handle hearing his stepfather speak from beyond death. Yes, I decided. He needs to hear this from Graham, before he has time to rebuild his defenses. The USB drive felt heavier than its weight, like holding a key to a room someone had locked from the inside. Thornton opened his office door. Through the gap, I could see the conference room across the hall. Desmond sat alone at the table, shoulders hunched, staring at the quarterly statements spread before him. Vivica's chair stood conspicuously empty. My mother had stepped out to give him space to process. "He needs to hear this from Graham," Thornton said quietly, echoing my earlier words. "But once we play it, there's no taking it back. Once he knows his stepfather saw his pain and loved him anyway, he can't unknow it." We reconvened at the estate that evening, autumn light fading through tall windows as Thornton set up his laptop in Graham's study. My mother sat in the corner chair, hands folded, face composed but pale. Graham's face filled the screen, older than Desmond remembered, tired in a way the living never noticed, and his first words weren't to Desmond at all. "Celeste, if you're watching this with him, leave the room." My mother stood immediately and walked out without a word. The door clicked shut with quiet finality. Desmond stared at the frozen image of his stepfather, Thornton pressed play. Son, Graham said, and Desmond flinched at the word. If you're watching this, the truth came out the hard way. I'm sorry. Your mother and I debated 1,000 ways to tell you about the trust, and none felt right because the real issue was never the money. It was the wound you've carried since you were 3 years old. Graham shifted in his chair. I see how you carry the weight of being the unwanted first son. You were always my son, Desmond. Not my stepson. My son. And I wish I'd told you sooner. Desmond's breath caught. Graham's recorded voice filled the silence. Desmond had spent 39 years trying to escape. Your mother didn't pity you. She knew you'd burn everything down to prove you didn't need saving. So she saved you anyway. The trust isn't apology for your existence. It's proof she believed you'd survive your own anger. Graham's hands folded on the desk where I'd done homework while he read beside me. I chose you, Desmond. The day I married your mother, I chose to be your father, not because I had to, because I wanted to. Because I saw a smart kid who needed someone to tell him he belonged without condition. I failed at that. I let you think belonging had to be earned. Graham's voice broke slightly. You already belonged. From the first day. I'm sorry I didn't make that clearer. Desmond's face was wet with tears. The trust exists because your mother loves you enough to protect you from yourself. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to deserve it. It's yours because you're hers and you're mine. And that's enough. Graham leaned forward, looking directly into camera. I love you, son. I'm proud of the man you've become. And I hope when you're ready, you can forgive the time we wasted not saying this plainly. The video ended. The screen went black. Desmond collapsed forward, hands covering his face, sobs shaking his shoulders. I stayed silent, giving him space to break, in a way he'd probably never allowed himself. He knew, Desmond gasped. The whole time, he knew, and I never. He loved you, I said quietly. That's what he's saying. The tears came like a dam, breaking decades of pressure released in moments. I called her controlling, Desmond choked out. I brought Vivica to prove God. What have I done? His hands shook as he reached for the laptop, replaying the section where Graham said, Always my son. He watched it 3 times before finally closing the screen. An hour later, he asked Thornton to gather everyone in the main room. The family assembled slowly, relatives taking seats with careful quiet. My mother entered last, eyes red but dry, and sat beside me without speaking. Desmond stood at the front, his suit rumpled, face showing every minute of emotional devastation. When he spoke, his voice shook but held steady. I owe my mother and my sister an apology that no words can cover. I withdraw every demand, every accusation, every legal challenge I've made or considered making. The room held absolute silence. I wanted Paloma to be the villain, he continued, looking at me. I wanted to believe she'd manipulated our mother because accepting that Mom loved me, despite everything, I am felt impossible. It was easier to be angry than vulnerable. His gaze shifted to our mother. You tried to protect me from my own fear. You created a trust worth millions, managed it for 20 years in secret, to give me security without humiliation. And I responded by calling you controlling. By trying to take control of the family. By bringing someone who only wanted money I didn't even know existed. My mother stood slowly, crossing the room to stand before her son. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice was quiet and clear. I never needed you to be different, Desmond. I needed you to be safe. She pulled him into an embrace. He collapsed into her arms, all 6 feet of him folding into her smaller frame, crying against her shoulder while she whispered words too soft for anyone else to hear. No one clapped. No one spoke. Reconciliation doesn't sound like movies. As family members began filing out quietly, giving the moment privacy, Thornton approached me with a final envelope, marked Asset Distribution Final Provisions. His expression was unreadable. "Your mother had one more instruction," he said softly, "about what happens now that Desmond has come home." The following week, Desmond and I sat across from each other at Thornton's conference table, signing documents that would have been battlegrounds just days earlier. My signature looked nothing like Desmond's mine, confident and looping, his tight and controlled, but for the first time, they appeared side by side on the same page without litigation. "Your mother included provisions for this outcome," Thornton said, sliding another document across the polished mahogany. "She hoped you'd find your way here." The reconciliation clause, he called it. Assets divided by actual competencies rather than symbolic punishment or assumed hierarchy. I retained control of the foundation, the work I'd built over 5 years, the programs serving thousands. Desmond received an operations role at Ashford Financial Group with board oversight, real responsibility tempered by collaborative accountability. The Meridian Trust would release in stages, tied to what Thornton carefully termed therapeutic milestones. Checkpoints, ensuring the money supported healing, rather than enabling old patterns. "She gave me a way back," Desmond said quietly, staring at the provision. "Even after everything. We run the family business together," I said. "Or we don't run it at all." He looked up at me, something like gratitude mixed with residual shame in his expression. We signed without attorneys present, choosing trust over defense. Reconciliation looked like paperwork mundane, anticlimactic, exactly as permanent as dramatic confrontation never is. That evening, Desmond told me later, he returned to his apartment expecting normalcy. Instead, he found Vivica methodically packing designer luggage in the bedroom, her movements efficient and emotionless. He said. He stood in the doorway, watching her fold clothes that had occupied his closet for 18 months, and felt nothing. No anger. No betrayal. Just the quiet recognition that this ending had been inevitable from the moment she'd pressured him to delay the will reading. "I'm not going to pretend this was ever about love," Vivica had said, without looking up from her suitcase. We both knew what this was. "I wanted someone who saw me as powerful," Desmond admitted to me when he recounted the conversation. "She needed someone who'd be powerful. We were using each other." Vivica had zipped the suitcase, set it by the door, and pulled her key from her purse. She'd placed it on the kitchen counter with careful precision, no dramatic throw, no accusation, just the quiet dissolution of a transactional arrangement that no longer served its purpose. "For what it's worth," she'd said at the door, "I hope you figure out who you are without an audience." The key hitting the counter made almost no sound, but Desmond heard it like a door closing on a version of himself he'd outgrown. Weeks later, her attorney sent a letter threatening a palimony claim, an attempt to stake ownership over money she'd never touched. He told me he'd stood in the silent apartment for 10 minutes after she left, waiting for the familiar, crushing loneliness to arrive. The feeling that had driven him to Vivica in the first place. The need for someone to witness his success, to validate his worth, to prove he wasn't the unwanted child from the first marriage. But it didn't come. Instead, he said, he felt unexpectedly light. The apartment seemed bigger without her presence, or maybe he felt smaller in a way that didn't hurt anymore. No performance required. No resentment to maintain, no constant calculation of who had power and who was proving what. He'd found Graham's photo on the bookshelf, the framed picture from their last fishing trip. Graham smiling in a way that crinkled his eyes. Desmond said the frame had no dust on it, never did, because he'd never stopped looking at it, even when he'd been angry about everything else. "You said I'd survive my own anger," he'd whispered to the photograph. "I didn't believe you." When he recounted this to me days later over coffee, his voice broke slightly at that part. He said he'd cried there in his empty apartment, but differently than before. Not the devastating sobs of the conference room or the cathartic release after Graham's video. Just quiet tears for time wasted, and family nearly destroyed, and a stepfather who'd loved him enough to record a message for after his own death. "The apartment feels bigger without her," he'd told the photo. "Or maybe I feel smaller in a way that doesn't hurt." I wasn't fixed. But he was, for the first time in decades, willing to be broken differently. "I don't know who I am without being angry," he'd said aloud to the empty apartment. "But I'd like to find out." When he told me all of this, I understood why I needed to send him the message. Not immediately, he needed time to sit with the silence. But a week later, when the rawness had settled into something more sustainable, I pulled up my phone and typed, "Foundation board meeting next week. Mom left you something there too. You should come." I attached a photo I'd taken earlier that day. The Foundation's conference room table. A nameplate reading Desmond Ashford, Advisory Board, positioned beside mine. "Our mother had ordered it months ago," Thornton told me. "Before Graham's death. Before the will reading. Before any of us knew whether reconciliation was possible. She'd hoped. Despite everything, she'd hoped." I hit send and watched the message status change to delivered, then read. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again, as Desmond typed and deleted responses. Finally, a single word, "Okay." Not gratitude, not apology, not the performative enthusiasm of someone trying to prove they'd changed. Just simple acceptance of an invitation to show up. It was enough. The email went out at 7:42 a.m. Organizational changes. Desmond Ashford transitioning to employee development. And by 8:00 his office phone had stopped ringing because everyone assumed it was a mistake. It wasn't. I sat in the back of the conference room. 3 weeks later, watching my brother address the department heads, who'd spent years treating him as the heir apparent to executive leadership. He stood at the front without notes, his posture less rigid than I remembered from corporate presentations past. "I've been VP of Operations for 6 years," he began. "I was competent at it, but I was chasing a title that made me feel powerful, instead of doing work that made me feel purposeful." The silence in the room shifted from confusion to careful attention. "My mother created a trust fund for me because she knew I'd sabotage myself trying to prove I didn't need protection." His voice stayed steady despite the personal nature of the admission. She was right. I spent decades making decisions based on fear of being overlooked, rather than genuine passion for the work. I explained the mentorship program he'd designed, structured guidance for junior employees, particularly those who seemed driven by the same demons that had driven him. Not a demotion, he clarified, but a deliberate choice to do work that mattered beyond quarterly reports. Nobody laughed, nobody questioned. They just believed him. When someone asked why I was present, Desmond gestured toward me. "The mentorship program was my brother's idea," I said simply. "I'm just making sure the company supports it." The room filed out slowly, several executives stopping to shake Desmond's hand with something approaching respect. Not the deference they'd shown the VP. Something more genuine. 3 weeks into the program's launch, I stopped by Desmond's new office, smaller than his VP suite, furnished with comfortable chairs instead of imposing desk barriers. Jordan Hayes sat across from him, a young analyst, maybe 25, ambitious and defensive in ways I recognized from stories Desmond had told me about his younger self. "How did you get to VP so young?" Jordan was asking when I paused in the doorway. "What's the secret?" Desmond smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Don't confuse being admired with being loved. They're not the same, and only one will sustain you." Jordan frowned, processing. "Everyone here acts like vulnerability is weakness. You're saying it's not?" "I'm saying I spent 20 years being admired and feeling empty. Then I spent 1 month being vulnerable and actually felt human." Desmond leaned back in his chair. "Admiration is performance. Love is permission to be real. Figure out which one you're chasing before you build a career on the wrong foundation." I slipped away before they noticed me, but Jordan's expression stayed with me. The visible relief of someone receiving permission to be human instead of perfect. Healing doesn't look like triumph. It looks like a 39-year-old man admitting he spent 2 decades chasing the wrong definition of success. The board meeting happened the last week of December. Winter light slanting through tall windows as executives gathered around the mahogany table where major decisions were made. I'd attended these meetings before as foundation director, presenting annual reports and funding requests, but never as a voting member. The board chair, Harold Winters, called the meeting to order and moved quickly through preliminary business before reaching the agenda item that made my pulse quicken. "Ms. Ashford's leadership of the Ashford Charitable Foundation demonstrates strategic acumen this board needs," he announced. "Her work growing the foundation from $8 million to its current $35 million in assets. Her partnerships across 3 states. Her documented impact on thousands of families. This represents exactly the vision and execution we require. Her appointment as director is, frankly, overdue." The vote was unanimous. Afterward, Harold walked me to the boardroom where brass nameplates marked each director's seat. Mine had been installed that morning. Paloma Ashford, Director. The company directory would be updated by end of day, my bio appearing alongside executives who'd previously dismissed me as just the charity daughter. "My mother taught me that power is only meaningful when it serves others," I said when Harold asked for comments. "I'll try to remember that here." Desmond had watched from the gallery, invited as my guest. When the meeting adjourned, he approached with his hand extended. I shook it, formal in front of witnesses, but his grip was warm. "You earned this a decade ago," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I made you wait." "You didn't make me wait," I corrected. "You just didn't see me. There's a difference." His name in brass, Paloma Ashford, director, proof that visibility was never the same as validation, but it helped. Walking out together through the main lobby, I stopped at the building's dedication plaque near the entrance. Ashford Financial Group, Est, 1987, by Celeste Ashford, in raised bronze letters, but below it, catching afternoon light, a new addition I hadn't noticed before. A smaller plaque, "In memory of Graham Merritt, who taught us that family is built, not inherited." Desmond's hand reached out slowly, fingers tracing his stepfather's name. The brass was still shiny. "Recently installed." "Mom ordered this," I said. "Last week. She wanted it up before your first day with the mentorship program. His fingers lingered on Graham's name. Built, not inherited, he read aloud. He told me that once. I didn't understand what he meant. Do you now? Yeah. His hand dropped, but his gaze stayed on the plaque. Yeah, I think I do. 3 place settings instead of 4. The arithmetic of loss never stopped hurting. But a year later, the empty chair at the head of the table felt less like absence and more like memory. I smoothed the linen napkin across my lap, watching candlelight flicker across familiar faces. Desmond sat to my left, Mom across from us, and between us lay 12 months of tentative reconstruction. The dining room at Ashford Estate looked exactly as it had the night of Graham's funeral, but everything else had changed. The scholarship applications came in stronger than expected, I said, reaching for the wine. We're funding 8 recipients this year, instead of the projected 5. Mom's eyes brightened. Graham would have loved that. What's the focus? First-generation college students pursuing public service degrees. I glanced at the empty chair, felt the familiar ache. Let it pass. He always said privilege was only worth something if you leveraged it for people who didn't have it. He did say that. Desmond's voice held no edge, no defensiveness, just acknowledgement. Usually, right before writing another check he couldn't really afford. I looked at my brother, really looked. The tension that had carved permanent lines around his mouth had softened. He'd lost weight, but not from stress this time. From the morning runs he'd mentioned during our monthly lunches, from sleeping through the night without Ambien. Vivica's lawsuit settled last week, he said quietly. She dropped the palimony claim, signed an NDA. It's done. Mom set down her fork carefully. How are you feeling about that? Relieved. Desmond took a slow breath. Angry it took this long. Embarrassed I didn't see it coming. He met my eyes. Grateful Paloma warned me anyway, even when I was too stupid to listen. A year ago, silence at this table felt like ceasefire. Tonight it felt like peace. You weren't stupid, I said. You were in love. Or thought you were. There's a difference between stupidity and manipulation. The therapist says the same thing. A wry smile. Twice a week, actually. Mom's hand found mine across the table, squeezed. We'd all been doing the work, individual therapy, occasional family sessions, the messy business of rebuilding trust. One honest conversation at a time. No more performance. No more corporate masks at the dinner table. Dessert came Graham's favorite bourbon pecan pie, because some traditions deserved keeping. Desmond served, his movements easy, unguarded. Jordan Hayes got the promotion, he said, sliding a plate toward me. Director of Client Relations, 26 years old, youngest director in company history. The protege you've been mentoring? I asked. He nodded, and something unfamiliar crossed his face. Joy. Uncomplicated, unperformed joy. Started as my assistant 2 years ago. Brilliant, hungry, no connections. Reminded me of... He stopped, reconsidered. Reminded me of who I could have been if I'd focused on building instead of proving. That's wonderful, Desmond. It is. He sounded surprised by his own conviction. I've been teaching a workshop at Northeastern too, career development for business students, helping them navigate corporate politics without losing themselves in it. A pause. Turns out I'm good at developing people when I'm not competing with them. Mom's smile held layers. I couldn't quite read pride, relief, something deeper. Something almost like sorrow. I realized I couldn't remember the last time Desmond smiled without calculation behind it. You found your place, Mom said softly. Both of you have. The foundation suits you, Paloma. And Desmond watching you step into leadership through mentorship instead of domination. Her voice caught. Your father would be so proud. The candles burned lower. Outside, November wind rattled the windows, same as it had a year ago, but we'd weathered worse than weather. There's something I need to tell you both. Mom's tone shifted, and I felt my spine straighten instinctively. Desmond's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. She folded her hands on the table, CEO posture, but her knuckles were white. The wine glass didn't tremble in Celeste's hand. That was the first sign something was wrong. I'm sick, she said. No preamble, no softening. Pure Celeste efficiency. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed 14 months ago. 3 months before your father died. The room tilted. 14 months. 14 months of carrying this alone. Before the funeral. Before the will reading. Before everything. That's not possible, I heard myself say. You would have told us. You would have. I couldn't. Mom's composure cracked at the edges. Not then. Not when everything was already falling apart. Desmond's chair scraped back. How long have you known? How long have you been dealing with this alone? 14 months. Chemo bought me time, but not much. She met our eyes, steady despite everything. I have perhaps 6 months left. 6 months. The words didn't land, didn't register, couldn't register. The estate confrontation, I whispered, pieces clicking into horrible place. You knew. When you forced us to talk that night, when you made us face everything you already knew you were dying. Mom's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. I couldn't leave you broken. I couldn't die knowing my children hated each other, knowing this family would fracture the moment I was gone. Her voice dropped to barely audible. I had to fix us first, while I still could. The silence after Celeste's words wasn't shock we'd both learned, this terrible year, that the people you love are always more fragile than you let yourself believe. Desmond's face had gone pale, his fork suspended mid-air. I felt my breath catch, candlelight blurring through tears. 6 months. The phrase kept repeating. How long have you known? Desmond's voice cracked. Did Dad know? Mom's composure held, barely. Graham knew. We discussed it the week after my diagnosis. We agreed I'd wait until you two found your way back to each other. I couldn't leave you broken. The revelation landed like a hammer. Graham had known. They'd planned this together. The brutal estate confrontation. The forced reckoning. Orchestrated by 2 dying parents, desperate to heal their children before time ran out. You spent your last year fixing us instead of letting us care for you. My voice sounded hollow. I spent it making sure you'd have each other after I'm gone. Mom reached across the table, one hand to each of us. Graham's death was sudden. Mine won't be. That's a gift. Time to prepare. Time to say everything that matters. Desmond's hand found hers first, then mine followed. His fingers were shaking. I'm so angry at you, he whispered, and so grateful. And I don't know which one to feel first. Feel both. Mom's thumb traced circles against his knuckles. You're allowed both. Tears spilled down my cheeks, but they didn't taste like the salt of Graham's funeral. That grief had been amputation. Sudden, violent, irreversible. Grief is different when you're given time to say goodbye. It arrives like winter instead of flood. The chemo, I managed, bought me 14 months instead of 6. worth every miserable session. Mom's smile was tired but genuine. I got to see Desmond find himself. Got to watch you build the foundation. Got to sit at this table tonight knowing my family will survive me. Desmond made a sound halfway between laugh and sob. Most mothers would have spent their last year traveling. I did. Mom's eyes gleamed. This was my bucket list. You two, whole, together. The weight settled over us, not crushing, but grounding. Purpose recognized too late to thank the architect, but early enough to honor the blueprint. Mom withdrew her hands slowly, straightened in her chair. When she reached for her wine glass, her fingers were steady. She raised it high. To Graham, she said, voice clear. Who taught us that family isn't what you inherit, it's what you build? Desmond and I lifted our glasses, crystal catching candlelight, to the man who loved us enough to call us on our worst behavior. Mom continued, who saw past performance to potential. Who knew? Her voice broke, just once. Who knew I'd need help finishing what we started? We drank in silence. The wine tasted like memory rich, complex, bittersweet. I wish he could see you two now. Mom set her glass down carefully. Not tolerating each other, not performing for corporate functions. Actually choosing to be family. He'd probably take credit for the whole thing, Desmond said, and we all laughed because it was true. The money, the company, none of it matters. Mom looked between us, memorizing faces. This, you two. Together, this is what I needed to see before I go. What do you inherit when your mother gives you back your sibling? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and unnecessary. Some inheritances couldn't be appraised or allocated. Some assets appreciated only after you stopped trying to claim exclusive ownership. We'll get through this, I said. However you want to handle it. Treatment decisions, end-of-life planning, we're here. I know you are. Mom's smile held peace I'd never seen before. That's why I can let go. The candles burned lower. Desmond refilled wine glasses with steady hands. We talked quietly about logistics, oncologist appointments, estate documents, whether Mom wanted to stay at Ashford Estate. Practical conversations that felt nothing like the legal warfare of a year ago. My thoughts drifted to Graham's funeral. 7 SUVs full of relatives expecting spectacle. Desmond arriving with Vivica and an attorney. Armor thick enough to deflect any vulnerability. The accusations, the rage that masked something deeper. I understood now what Celeste and Graham had both seen. Desmond never lacked love. He lacked permission to accept it without shame, to believe he deserved it without earning it through corporate conquest. The resentment he'd carried for 39 years wasn't built on facts. It was built on fear. Fear that if he stopped performing, stopped proving, he'd discover he was dispensable. I wasted so much time being angry about things you never actually did to me. Desmond's voice pulled me back. He stared at the empty chair. Things I imagined. Things I assumed. 3 place settings. 1 empty chair. And finally, a family that chose each other. We all wasted time, Mom said gently. That's what makes the time we have left so valuable. Outside the dining room window, the first snow of November began to fall. Soft flakes drifted past glass, catching light from inside. I watched them settle on Graham's memorial bench, in the garden that empty seat. Another placeholder for absence that had become memory. Desmond noticed too. His gaze followed mine to the window, then shifted to Mom. Without words, he reached for her hand again. I did the same. We sat together in silence that felt nothing like the void at Graham's funeral. This silence was full of understanding earned through pain, of connection forged through honesty, of family built from choice rather than obligation. Sometimes what we resent never belonged to anyone else, I said softly, watching snow fall. We just never dared to ask, looking back. I wish I'd reached out to Desmond sooner, before the funeral, before the will, before years of silence built walls between us. I saw his anger, but didn't look for the pain underneath. I assumed he knew he was loved when he'd spent decades convinced otherwise. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait for crisis to force the conversation your family needs. This wasn't a revenge story. It was a rescue mission. My mother and stepfather saw what I couldn't. That love withheld, even unintentionally, creates the same damage as love withdrawn. They knew Desmond's resentment wasn't about money, it was about belonging. And I believe God's timing, though painful, gave us exactly what we needed when we needed it most. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't assets or estates. It's the courage to be vulnerable enough to rebuild. What looks like a revenge story from the outside is often a healing story from within. If this story resonated with you, or if you've lived your own version of this journey, please leave a comment below. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like more stories about family, forgiveness, and second chances, please subscribe to Every Story Matters, including yours. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. As always, some details have been adjusted for